Hi, good day again. A very warm welcome back to my audience. This is the second video in a three-part series that we are talking about the Protection of Personal Information Act number 2013, namely called POPI or POPI. This is an employee training video part 2, and this will be more looking at the implementation side of the POPI Act rather than in the first video that we have spoken about the overview. It's presented by myself, JAP Kukumur and Associates, and this falls with all your compliance requirements. Once again, thank you for being back and hope that you will enjoy this training session. The presentation overview will be looking at some objectives of the way going forward. What is the background to the reason for this training? What needs to be done most important, so what is our actions and action plans, steps to the implementation that you should take to make sure that you are compliant by July 1st, 2021, and then ultimately what documents is going to be required and needs to be in place in terms of the compliance, and then some recommendations that I would like to make. Now, if we just go back to our first training video, again, let's just look at some background. The Act does not apply to personal information processed in the course of personal or household activity. Now, any activity household, I think this is going to be tested. If you've got a maid or a gardener and you take personal information, I think that's going to be tested. But again, it does not comply in terms of household activity. Or whether the processing authority is a public body involved in national security, defense, public safety, anti-money laundering, or the cabinet or executive council of the province, or as part of a justiciable function. So again, this is when the Act does not comply. Personal information can only be processed, again, section 11, when? With the consent of a data subject. So as and when you do process personal information, you have to do it with a consent of a data subject. Normally that refers to your employee. If it is necessary for the conclusion or performance of a contract to which the data subject is a party, your employment contract for that matter, or when it is required by law, revenue services, it protects a legitimate interest of the data subject. It is necessary to pursue your legitimate interests or the interest of a third party to whom the information is supplied. So again, any third party might be the medical aid. Now, when you do data collection, the responsible party again will refer to the organization, has to collect personal information directly from the data subject unless this information is contained in some public record or has been deliberately published by the data subject himself. As said previously, when I send out emails, I deliberately give out my detail for marketing purposes. Collecting the information from another source does not prejudice the subject. Data collection continue. It is necessary for some public purpose or to protect your own interests. Obtaining the information directly from the subject would prejudice a lawful purpose or is not reasonably possible. Again, as I said in my previous presentation, when a person is in an accident, can't talk for themselves, and it is not reasonably possible for that subject or data subject to provide personal information. You can only collect personal information for a specific, explicitly defined and lawful purpose. Only for that. And the subject must be aware of the purpose for which the information is being collected. And that is referred to section 13 of the Act. When information is being collected, subjects must be made aware of section 18. So your data subject must be made aware of the information that is being collected, and if the information is not being collected from the subject. So again, if a third party, or maybe it's a minor, and you collect the data from a parent, the subject must be made aware of the source from which the information is being collected, the name and address of the person or organization collecting the information, and the purpose of the collection of information, whether the supply of the information by the subject is voluntary or then mandatory, the consequences of failure to provide the information, whether the information is being collected in accordance with any law. So what consequences might lead in the event of collecting data. When information is being collected, subjects must be made aware of Section 18 continue, if it is intended for the information to leave the country, and at what level of protection will be afforded to the information after it has left South Africa. In other words, it might be that your holding company is sitting in the UK, it's a cross-border transfer of personal information, and what protection is going to be provided when it leaves South Africa. Who will be receiving this information? That the subject has access to the information and the right to rectify any details. If there's mistakes or if it's not valid and true, the subject has the right to object to information being processed if such rights exists, and that's why you have to make it clear in your employment contract as well as in your privacy and security policy that as and when the subject does not want it to be processed, it could mean that there's an end to the employment contract, and that the subject has the right to lodge a complaint to the information regulator. The contact details of the information regulator must also be supplied, and that is also normally part of your policy and security document. Direct marketing. Let's just have a brief look at what the Act says about direct marketing. Section 69 of the Act outlaws direct marketing by means of any form of electronic communication unless the subject has given their consent. So in other words, I might send out a marketing email as a first email, and after that the subject or data subject has to give consent for me to send a second email. Such an electronic communication obviously includes emails and SMSs or MMSs. Automatically calling machines are also included. A subject can only be approached once to obtain such a consent. Once such consent is refused, it is forever. So I need to delete it from my database. Slightly different rules apply if the subject is a customer. So in other words, somebody buying from you. Here the customer's contact details must have been obtained in the context of the sale of the product or service. The direct marketing by electronic communication can only relate to the supplier's own similar products or service, and the customer must have been given the right to opt out at the time that the information was collected and each time such communication is sent. In other words, I'm buying some hardware from a hardware store, they're taking my contact details, they start sending out marketing material. It has to be in line of what that specific shop is selling, and if I want to opt out, I have to have some kind of an unsubscribe button to actually opt out, and then the suppliers or customers needs to delete my detail. Anybody sending out direct marketing electronic communication has to disclose the identity of the advertiser and provide an address to which the customer can send a request to opt out. Again, it has to have some kind of an unsubscribe button whereby I can request that I've been unsubscribed from a newsletter or any marketing material. Now, how do we go about informalizing your POPI Act compliance project? Let's look at a few steps. First and foremost, identify your relevant stakeholders who's going to play a role in setting up the POPI Act compliance. Identify your project sponsor. I strongly suggest that you tackle this by means of a project plan. Get your project sponsor to approve. Identify your project manager and set high-level scope timescales, and have a budget to actually implement your POPI Act compliance. Continuing, in terms of formalize your POPI Act compliance project, appoint an information officer. Very important that a person responsible and accountable and liable for taking ownership of compliance when it comes to the POPI Act, and as said in my previous video, that's normally the head of the organization. Further to that, ensure alignment between your promotion of Access to Information Act, POPI, and POPI Information Officer. Decide whether the CEO can fulfill the role of the Information Officer or whether he is going to delegate his responsibilities and authorities to a second or third person. The functions or needs a deputy or, as I said, that's delegated, Deputy Information Officer. Agree that the Information Officer or the Deputy Information Officer roles and responsibilities by means of a formal appointment letter, mandate, and a job output, and then complete the formal appointment process by both parties signing the document. Formalize your POPI compliance project. Continue. You need to perform a gap analysis versus the POPI Act. On the end of the day, you can only build bridges if you know what the gap is and pertains to non-compliance when it comes to POPI Act. You need to set interim and final targets for compliance with the POPI Act. This does not mean slavishly shooting for 100% regardless of costs and benefits. So if you've got a project plan, you've got targets, you've got dates, you can basically then aim to reach those objectives by time and date. Engage with stakeholders in the assessment so that everybody knows and everybody is aware of the gaps that needs to be filled with the time scales, time and dates, as well as the budget allocated. Use an evidence-based approach. On the end of the day, people need to know that we cannot claim for fame if there's nothing in place. Use the assessment for ongoing compliance and monitoring. So if you've got a gap analysis, you've done the assessment, you can update it on a regular basis so as to know where you are with compliance in terms of the POPI Act. Formalize your POPI Act compliance project. Analyze what and how personal information is processed. Use a broad definition of record types as per POPI Act, e.g. CCTV, biometric, any other information you need to include, as well as special information. Bear in mind, we spoke about special information and we will look at that again. Look at various aspects as required by the POPI Act, including consent, purpose, source, sharing, and the distraction thereof. Consider user rights and their management. Think broadly in terms of the types of devices where data is stored and represents a security compromised risk. I strongly suggest that you do an asset register in terms of where information is kept, so that you can look at these risks or those risks in terms of security compromise. Formalize your POPI Act compliance project. Implement POPI Act compliance policies, and we'll be looking at those. Review existing relevant policies. Ensure your policies are reasonable and appropriate to your organization. As previously said, we cannot copy and paste. We need to know what's happening within the business and how your practices and processes are working within the organization. Make sure your policies are enforceable. Design your privacy notices for diverse stakeholder groups, in other words, people you're dealing with. Formalize your POPI Act compliance project. Review your website, very important, we tend to forget. Develop your checklists of what to review. Agree a rating scheme to be used. Use the opportunity to implement best practice or practices such as cookie notifications. you will notice that when you open a website, there's always an agreement or non-agreement tab which you have to click. So that is good practices to notify that you use cookies in the event of you do use cookies. Develop and implement your remediation plan so that you can rectify whatever is not in compliance with the POPI Act. Formalize your POPI Act compliance project. Update. Create your papaya manual. Very important. People tend to forget that there's also the process of access to personal information. Confirm your organization needs. Promotion of Access to Information Act manual and by when. Confirm whether you are a public or a private body as the Papaya Act. Review the proposed content of your Papaya manual in terms of the requirements, and ensure your Papaya manual follows the prescribed layout, includes the necessary details. And once again, there's clear guidelines of how your Papaya manual should follow lead. Formalize your POPI Act compliance project. Continue. Implement POPI compliant personal information management processes. Look at the personal information life cycles, including acquisitions, your purchases, processing, retention, and your distraction practices. So why are requiring personal information? For how long are we going to keep it, and how are we going to get rid of it? Develop reasonable and appropriate measures to ensure ongoing compliance. These include self-assessments, health checks, and formal audits on a regular basis. It's not completed once the paperwork has been completed. We need to go back and check, recheck, and making sure that we are in full compliance. Develop your dashboard for compliance. Again, by why are we doing it? For what reason are we doing it? When, who, and how are we going to do it? Formalize your POPI compliance project. Again, train stakeholders about their roles in POPI Act compliance. So if there's a board of directors or there's an executive board of directors, they should know what their roles in terms of compliance are. Design training according to their needs. Ensure you treat user education not as a once-off series of activities, but part of an ongoing commitment. Again, train, retrain, and train again. Leverage diverse training methods, including self-study, online, classroom, audio, and video. And this is why I'm making this 3-part video series, that you can go back and train and retrain and re-inform employees, stakeholders, and yourself. Look to the special needs, such as the information officer and their roles, or the deputy information officer roles. Formalize your POPI compliance project. Make POPI Act compliance business as usual. So this is the way we do business on a day-to-day business, and just make it part of your business culture. Recognize that POPI Act compliance will be the new normal and work that way. Again, make it part of your business culture. In your morning toolbox talks with your people in the workshop, floor level, again, just make it part of the total culture of the organization. Build compliance into your products, services, and processes. Adopt privacy by design. So whatever we do, always bear in mind that privacy has got a role to play in terms of whether we advertise on the website, whether we direct market our products, that there is that privacy. Ensure ongoing monitoring of the data protection, POPI ecosystem, what legislation, regulations, opportunities, and threats. Again, your typical SWOT analysis, that we are aware that there's changes, there's addendums, there's amendments, and that we are on top of whatever changes there is, or there are. Build POPI into your everyday operations. Make POPI business as usual. Again, I can't reiterate it more, that it becomes the way we do. It becomes just the way as part of life, and the way we do business. Steps to your POPI Act compliance project. You need to have a commencement and a start date. Otherwise, you're never going to complete this in time and make sure that we are in full compliance. Set yourself up for success by formalizing your compliance activities. So again, if you've got a project sponsor, you've got a project plan, you've got timelines, milestone dates, make sure that we stick and stay to these. Otherwise, you're going to roll over and you're going to be caught up in such activities that you're not being in full compliance by the time that we have to be. Establish a compliance preparation project team. Again, we cannot work in isolation. I strongly suggest that you put up a team that several persons are working on several items, and that you at least meet weekly. Ensure you have proper authorization and funding. Again, can't work without the authorization, and very important, not having a budget. Project charter is drawn up and approved by the project sponsor. Update and sign the project charter so that everybody knows what's included in the charter so that you can continue. Update and appoint the information officer and deputy information officer on formal appointment letters. Develop an opening plan of action, so having your kickoff meeting and decide who, why, when, how and what is going to take place. Ensure you identify and engage your stakeholders and role players within the business and within the organization. We cannot work in isolation. We need the buy-in, and that is why you need to keep everybody informed. Further steps to your POPI Act compliance project. You need to measure your successes and your milestones. Develop a solid business case based on impact area identification, costs and benefits of your compliance preparation project. Complete a structured compliance assessment in terms of the requirements of POPI Act. So you need to have a structured assessment to know what gaps needs to be filled and how we're going to build these bridges to fill these gaps. We have developed at CAS a compliance assessment tool to discover areas for remediation to address the requirements of POPI Act. Measure what is reasonable and appropriate again to what your organization, your processes entails, and not somebody else's. And then document the assessment that has been completed. It should be a live document, and you should tick boxes that has been completed. Steps to your POPI Act compliance project. You need to reflect on a regular basis of how far you have gotten in terms of the compliance. In the light of step 2, the assessment, reflect the areas that require remedial action to achieve an acceptable level of risks in terms of achieving compliance. Reflect what process, procedural, documentation, technical and contractual changes needs to be made in order to be compliant in terms of all your documents, your SLAs, your third-party agreements, possibly your employment contract. Reflect the entire personal information life cycle from acquirement through ultimate life disposal. So why are we keeping it? What are we keeping? And for how long are we keeping it? And how actually are we going to get rid of personal information after the life cycle is done? Reflect all the organizational and technical factors for success, e.g. what HR processes is going to be involved, your IT processes, other third-party processes. So again, what processes, procedures, policies is in place in terms of organizational factors and your technical factors. Are we using cloud service providers? Is there encryption? And how do we go about in making sure that there is protection for personal information? Obtain approval for a plan to achieve the requirement level of compliance. So at the end of the day, who's signing off? So to say that we are in compliance in terms of our requirements. Continue steps to your POPI Act compliance project. Now you need to convert, you need to actually take action now. Convert your plans into actions with clearly defined objectives by when, by whom, why, and by which date are we going to have everything completed. Milestones to the achievement. So we have to set dates and targets by when we're going to have things completed. Convert the conditions for lawful processing into specific evidence of your remediation plan taking effect. So making sure that as and when you require to present that you can in terms of evidence and your plan. Convert your short-term compliance preparation project into a long-term compliance commitment. As said again, business as usual. It's your business culture, and everybody working for the business are working towards this commitment. And then convert the costs of compliance into the benefits of compliance. On the end of the day, it's a costly exercise, but you don't want to land up in hot water. We have to go and explain to the regulator why, as to there were a breach in terms of personal information, the data recovery that might take a huge chunk out of your cash flow, as well as the image deficit that you actually gained in terms of the breach. At this point in time, I strongly suggest that you take a 5-minute, 10-minute break, go and make coffee, have a discussion with your fellow employees in terms of what we have discussed. And when we come back, we'll be looking at now what documentation policies actually is required in terms of the implementation of the POPI Act. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next slide. A very warm welcome back. I'm pretty sure that you had good discussion with your fellow employees. I can just see the amount of frustration knowing that there's limited time available and there's so much to be done. Again, if we start, we need to complete with time frames, dates, milestones, but we cannot leave it any longer. We need to start and make sure that we are in compliance by July 2021. Now let's look at some documentation required by POPI. First and foremost, your documentation management control system, whereby how you're going to control which policy, which documents, and where you're going to keep it and how you're going to control it. And lastly, your naming convention, how you're actually going to label all your documentation, and what type of labeling you're going to use in terms of all your documentation required. Then your procedure for document and record control. Who's going to have access to these documents, and what is your procedure in terms of controlling these records? Implement and maintain good governance and leadership structure. You should have a document or a one-page document at least talking and speaking about good governance and who's going to be involved in terms of your leadership structure when it comes to the procedural control of documentation. Your personal information protection policy. That is the most important document, I would say, in terms of all documents required of how you're going to protect personal information. Then your employee personal information protection policy. You are getting personal information from all your data subjects, your employees, and now you're going to protect their personal information. Your privacy notification to data subject when collecting personal information. Why are we collecting it? For what reason are we collecting it? For how long are we going to keep it? And how are we actually going to extract the information? Your document retention and destruction policy as set. Documents required, continue. Again, your appointment letter for your information officer or your deputy information officer with a mandate, with a job output level that is going to be required from the information officer. Access and confidentiality agreements with employees. Privacy management accountability framework. In other words, how you're going to manage your accountability and the framework around personal information and the protection thereof. Implement and maintain training and awareness program and keeping records of all training that has taken place by means of an attendance or attendance registers. Employee training attendance as set. And this focus on all employees of the organization right through from the lowest to the highest, and making sure that everybody has signed for the training and retraining and training again. Your training information security essentials by means of a PowerPoint presentation or PowerPoint presentations in the case of this 3-part video series. Training physical requirement essentials. What is going to be required in terms of physical evidence and physical documentation, also by means of a PowerPoint presentation. Presentation employee essentials PowerPoint. The 3rd part series of this training series will deal with what employees actually needs to know and their essential requirements in terms of the POPI Act. Documents required, continue. Implement and maintain personal information inventory. In other words, what are we keeping in terms of our data subjects, whether it's clients, customers, or your employees, or any third party, what are we keeping? What type of information do we keep? Having a personal information flowchart, assisting you in terms of who has got access to this information, where's the information stored, and how do you actually recover the information. Personal information assets, information classification matrix and handling guide. In other words, what is confidential, what is less confidential, and how you're actually going to handle these types of information. Inventory of records and personal information banks, so where you're actually keeping these records. Personal information assets hardware, in other words, is it stored in soft copy as well as in hard copy. Personal information assets shared database or basis, in other words, who's got access in terms of electronic or hard copy, and who's got access to this personal information. Personal information assets operating system and software, in other words, what operating system are we using? Is it going to be Windows? Is it going to be an open source? And what type of software? Is it normal Excel? Is it a database? Is it possibly Pastel, VIP? And how are we going to keep all this personal information? Your documentation required again. Create and maintain a policy and procedure in terms of the creation of documents that you're going to be required. Policy statement and manual for the POPI Act. So again, a 1-page document stating how you're going to actually safeguard personal information in terms of the POPI Act. Collection and use of personal and special personal information policy. Remember, we spoke about special personal information, and that normally goes around about sex, race, gender, disability, ethical background, etc., as in my first presentation. Collection and the use of children and minors' personal information. So again, very important, how you're going to collect and how you're going to use children and minors' personal information. It might be that you're working with learnerships or with internships that is still a minor, less 18 years, and then you need the consent of the parents in terms of collecting and the use of their information. Information quality policy. What is the quality in terms of your personal information, and how you're going to make sure that it is relevant and up to date. Social media policy. All your employees having access to WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., and how you're going to deal with personal information in that regard. Bring your own device policy. I mean, I've got a flash drive in my pocket, I've got a cell phone, which is my personal cell phone, and how are we going to deal with bring your own policy, bring your own device policy into play. Very important, clear screen and desktop policy, making sure that we've got a clear screen all the time we leave our workstation, and that there's no papers and little notes hanging around our offices as and when we close for business or as and when we leave our workstation. And then password management policy and guidelines. And then a shred it policy. How are we actually going to distract documentation, or are we going to merely throw it in the dustbin and hope that nobody sees it? Use of transportable media policy. In other words, any personal information that is transportable, how are we going to deal with that, and how are we going to also deal with the media in terms of breaches. Documentation required. Continue. Managing your data subjects' rights. How are we going to go about that? Consent to use employee personal information policy. And again, an addendum to the employment contract whereby they actually are giving consent to use certain information for purposes as previously mentioned. Authorization for release of personal information, third parties. Again, if and when there's a third party involved, it might be your medical aid, might be revenue services. Is there authorization and consent that you can give out personal information? Practice payment policy. Practice privacy notification, employee handout. Employee identification policy. So actually, how are we going to identify, by what means are we going to identify, and what personal information are required to identify. Documentation required. Continue. Manage information security risk or risks during communication and transmission. How are we going to manage that? Guidelines for the use of email by employees. Again, as said, all your employees should have a disclaimer on their email for the purpose of intent and making sure everybody has, or all employees are using the guidelines set for using emails. Also, instant messaging, security and usage guidelines, where there's MMSs or SMSs or WhatsApps. What is the guidelines pertaining to that? Guidelines for the use of faxes by employees. Again, faxes is outdated, but there is still faxes going around. And what is the guidelines for the use of faxes by employees? Are we actually let it lie around the fax machine, or how are we keeping personal information safe? Employee, and in the case of hospitals, doctors, patient consent for electronic communication. And then your fax cover letter, confidentiality notice, and disclaimer again of intent only for the person's eyes that is actually intended for. Documentation requirements. Continue. Managing your third-party compliance. In other words, you might be storing your information on cloud-based. How we handle that. Personal information handling questionnaire for suppliers and their contractors. And once again, you cannot have a document in place and you haven't checked the actually physically or the physical doing and compliance thereof. Confidentiality provisions for suppliers agreements. Approved vendors, making sure that you've got an approved vendor list and you're only making use of them, and also make provision for as and when some of them cannot supply, and having a third-party agreement in place for a possible new vendor. Security of personal information, very important. How do we secure any personal information that we gather? For that, having information security policy in place, and that possibly can be one document. Having a security and privacy policy can be one document in terms of addressing the security of personal information. Our last slide on documentation required or requirements. How do we respond to requests and complaints from individuals? There should be an objection process, personal information in terms of section 11.3. So how are we going to deal with any objections made by a data subject that will also form part of our privacy and security policy? Also, the request to correction of any personal information that is not correct, or the deletion of personal information, section 24.1 of POPI. Our legislation, regulation, ethical guidelines of, again, business as usual, and how are we going to ethically deal with breaches or the processing of personal information. And then the Protection of Personal Information Act 2013-04 should be on file, as well as the regulations relating to personal information. And again, the regulations that I think it has been enacted in October 2020, and the regulations do make provision for all the forms and the requirements in terms of response to the request and complaint. So all forms are in the regulations, so you don't have to go and reinvent all the forms, and you can use it as is. Now, to my audience, this concludes the documentation requirements. Again, I would suggest that you take a break now, have a discussion in terms of the way forward, and when we come back, we'll have a look at a couple of other things related to personal information and the protection thereof. So yes, please take a break, and we'll see you in the next slide. Again, welcome back. Before we continue talking about some other issues pertaining personal information, I can just see this Mount Olympus lying ahead. But again, to my audience, if you start and you make it part of your daily time management, and you work on this on a daily basis, setting time aside, the mountain will get smaller, and on the end of the day, we will be in compliance by the time reaches July 2021. So let's look at cloud computing quickly. It refers to transborder in terms of personal information leaving South Africa. So it might be that you've got somebody storing your documentation on a cloud-based, like said, Microsoft in the USA, and how do you make sure that that personal information is protected in terms of leaving South Africa, or as said, the holding company might be overseas. There is no restrictions in terms of personal information entering South Africa, although I strongly suggest that any personal information kept by a third party, that you also have a policy and procedure in place in terms of protecting that. Transborder personal information restrictions are intended to protect personal information in other jurisdictions. In other words, in other countries, we must make sure that as and when we send it, that our personal information is protected in terms of our data subjects. This protection can be achieved through various means, and we will discuss that. Proof of adequate protection, again, your service level agreements, and on the end of the day, if possible, you could have visited the actual physical site, making sure that there is compliance in terms of what we say we actually are doing. And then contracts binding agreements with indemnifying clauses, that in the event that there's a third party breach, that you have got an indemnifying clause that protects the business and the personal information officer. And then again, binding corporate rules on both sides. Cloud computing continue. Cloud computing carries specific and different risks to on-site management of personal information. Multiple standards and frameworks exists, and let's just look at a couple of examples. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, there is rules and there is a code in terms of making sure that there's a standard in terms of keeping personal information. COVID 5, security, control objective for information and related technologies. These guys are big and they do make sure that personal information is protected. ENISA, the European Network and Information Security Agency. Europe is actually very big on personal information and the protection thereof. And then CSA, Common Service Architecture, which is also part of the process of personal information protection in terms of cloud computing. And NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. So the reason I'm telling you this, that there is a lot of companies and processes already in place in making sure that there's no breach and leakage in terms of when it comes to personal information. Now, I think it's important to also look at mobile devices. You will know as part of your policy document, you've got bring your own device. So let's look at a couple of issues. It should be included as part of an overall risk assessment, and also not just a risk assessment, but also how are you going to control and or mitigate the risks when it comes to mobile devices. It represents a potential high level of probability of loss or compromise. It represents a potentially high level of impact if compromised. You can just imagine if you take your own personal cell phone, how much information of yourself, possibly of your co-workers, photos, videos is on your cell phone, and if stolen, if it lies around and somebody else can access, and what is the compromise in terms of data breaches, in terms of personal information. You might also include in terms of your policy document to eliminate USB sticks, hard drives, anything that carries documentation in terms of electronic format. Maybe you should prohibit any individual to bring a USB stick or use a USB stick at the workplace unless it's provided by the company and safeguarded. And then adequate protection would include encryption and other mobile device management methods. Strongly suggest in terms of personal cell phones or either company issued cell phones that it's password protected. There's a high level of security when it comes to mobile devices, and it is managed well in terms of data protection. Again, it's part of business as usual, and it's part of the business culture. Let's just quickly have a look at examples of POPI non-compliances. Lost or theft of paperwork lying around the shredder, lying around the fax machine. You possibly have printed something, you get busy, you get a phone call, and there's financial statements lying in the printer and you forgot to actually go and fetch it. Data posted or faxed to incorrect recipients. That happens. I mean, you possibly have made an error when you typed in the digital code in terms of the telephone number, and you fax your financial statements or you fax personal information to a third party, and it's actually not intended for that third party. So we need to make sure that as and when we do, we're making pretty sure that we are faxing the right and the correct stuff to the correct people. And again, having your indemnifying clause and your disclaimer in terms of your fax cover sheet. Data sent by email to incorrect recipients, that also happens quite a lot. And again, having a disclaimer so that you can protect the business, protect yourself in terms of a possible breach. Your insecure web page, including hacking. I mean, how secure is your web page? What means do you use in terms of securing your data, in terms of your web page and possible data stored on your web page? Loss or theft of encrypted devices like your mobile cell phone. the dark world is very clever, and we need to make sure that we've got a 3-pin security process when it comes to devices like a cell phone. Insecure disposal of paperwork, again, just throwing it in the dustbin, not making sure it's shredded and nobody actually can identify after we have de-identified anything on paperwork. Failure to redact or censor data, making sure that as and when we need to remove data or we have to censor data, that we do it well. Information uploaded to a web page, and how secure is it to upload information to a web page, and what breaches possibly can take place, that as and when we have to upload our ID, for instance, to a certain web page because of applying for something, how secure is that web page? And again, all web pages should have a privacy notice and privacy policy, making sure that you read through that and that there's not going to be a possible breach in terms of personal information. Verbal disclosure, in the sense of gossiping in the foyer or having a regular talk about certain things with a colleague or a possible customer. Just a general discussion might lead to possible leak in terms of personal information. And then insecure disposal of hardware. I mean, how do we get rid of our computers, our laptops that is not in use anymore? How much information is on those devices, and what did we do and how did we go about in terms of clearing any hard drives that might carry any personal information? What is the areas affected by POPI Act? Let's have a look. Again, as in my previous presentation, first and foremost, we collect information. What are we collecting? How are we collecting it? And by means of how are we safeguarding that when we collect information? Storage, where do we store it? And how do we safeguard any personal information in terms of either manual or electronic storage? How do we retrieve that data, and for what do we use the data when we do retrieve it? Again, how do we retain our personal information? And lastly, how are we going about in destroying or distracting that personal information and making sure that there's no breach? So again, very important slide. It's collect, store, retrieve. How do we use it, retain and destroy? And again, this should form part of our whole privacy and security policy. Now, what actions is required? Again, a comprehensive review of the current state of compliance, making use of the assessment tool, the questionnaire, to determine our gap so that we can start building those bridges in filling those gaps. That's the starting point. This typically reveals one or more gaps between the current and the required level of compliance, and what is going to be reasonable and appropriate. Again, this is key. What is happening in terms of your organization? It's not a copy and paste exercise. We need to make sure that anything and everything happening is part of the required policy or privacy policy and security policy. In conclusion then, thank you very much for listening. The protection of personal information isn't a choice. Again, it's going to be law, and we are all affected. And I want to reiterate again, whether you're running a one-man show from your house or from an office, and you have got an e-commerce site and you're gathering personal information, or whether you employ 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people, we are all affected in terms of gathering information and how we're dealing with that personal information. Again, make it part of business as usual, make it part of your business culture. And this is the way how we do things in this organization. Then again, you might have various questions or several questions. Please refer all questions to cas@businesscompliance.co.za. And as and when I get time, I will revert and answer these questions, or possibly phone or make an appointment to discuss possible areas that is a concern to your organization and business. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time, and I thank you. Again, this is not a fancy video series. This is not a fancy training video. This is an informative and knowledge-based video so that you can revert back, you can play it over and over again for you to understand. So I haven't tried to make it nice or to dolly it up. This is purely for information and for your own personal growth, and obviously for your compliance in terms of your organization, making sure that we are in compliance with what the POPI Act requires us to have in place by 1st July 2021. My name is J.P. Kokemoer, and I'm representing J.P. Kokemoer and Associates at your service for all your business compliance requirements. Once again, thank you for attending this training session, and lastly, make sure that you have signed the attendance register as to have proof that all employees have been trained, and as well giving your consent that we can use your personal information to prove that you actually have attended this training session. See you in the next video, the last part, where we will deal with employee training, what employees need to know in terms of their rights when it comes to personal information. Thank you once again, and see you then in the next video.